When it comes to winter weather forecasting, there's a few big buzzwords that get tossed around, right? Polar vortex, bombogenesis, Arctic invasion. But this season in particular, there's a big phrase that's going to be key. It's El Nino. A lot of you probably have a vague idea of what an El Nino means for us here in the Northeast, but the process that drives El Nino is actually pretty complex. Get your shades ready. We're headed to the tropical Pacific for this week's edition of Heather's Weather-Wise.
All other tropical storms must bow before El Nino.
Loyal fans of SNL may remember that Chris Farley sketch from back in 1997. That episode aired about a month before one of the biggest El Ninos on record was setting up. But not every El Nino is the same, and fortunately, no El Nino has ever featured Chris Farley in a whatever that was. No, El Nino is defined as unusually warm surface water in the eastern Pacific. But that warm water doesn't just appear there. Let's start off by looking at a more neutral pattern as far as El Nino is concerned. One where we usually have strong trade winds blowing from east to west. Those trade winds help to move an ocean current called the Humboldt Current. It moves up along the west coast of South America and then eventually gets pushed westward out into the central Pacific. Now, in the eastern half of the Pacific, the water at the surface is on the cooler side, but as it gets pushed out into the central Atlantic, it tends to start to warm up a little bit, and those strong trade winds along with the current help to pile up some of that warmer water into parts of the West Pacific near the islands of Southeast Asia. Now that's a typical pattern. What happens during an El Nino? These strong trade winds, they start to weaken. That means the Humboldt Current is going to be a little bit weaker and a little bit slower as a result. That means that warm water isn't getting piled up in the West Pacific. Instead, it's starting to drift farther back to the east. As warmer water starts to pile up near the coast of South America, we're able to declare an El Nino. But warmer is a really loose description. Surface temperatures only have to be half a degree Celsius above average for a weak El Nino. The strongest of El Ninos have seen ocean temperatures 5 degrees above normal. It's crazy to think that such a seemingly small difference can have such major global effects. But that tiny temperature shift ultimately affects the strength and pattern of the jet stream. That determines where persistent rain or drought may happen. And El Nino has a hand in everything from tropical storm frequency to drought and, yes, snowfall. In general, we've got a pretty good idea of what a strong El Nino type pattern is going to mean across North America. This is what a setup looks like for a relatively strong to moderate El Nino. The jet stream is usually pretty active in the southern half of the country, and that keeps it stormy all the way from central California to the southeastern states. Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes in the Northeast, things tend to be on the quieter side, and the air tends to be on the milder side as well, while we get maybe 1 or 2 coastal systems that move up the East Coast. Certainly over the last 3 major El Ninos, the warmth has been the case. 82-83 produced a very warm December. 97-98, remember I mentioned that as being one of the strongest El Ninos we've had. That gave us our second warmest February on record, and our warmest December ever occurred in 2015 and 2016. What's interesting though is that the connection when it comes to snowfall isn't nearly as strong. Check this out, over 112 inches in 82, but only 55 inches during a very similar El Nino setup in the year 2015 into 2016. All that tells us is that there are a lot more factors besides El Nino that are going to play into our winter forecast. But this year, things are going to be looking a little bit different. Remember I talked about El Nino not always setting up the same way? Well, this time it looks like the warmest of the water in the Pacific is going to set up a little bit farther into the central part of the ocean. That's going to shift the jet stream a little bit, and that's also going to shift where we see the warmest of the air. That could mean that there's more room for chilly air and perhaps even a few more storms in the Northeast this year compared to last year. If you want to see more of what we're expecting for this year's winter forecast, head over to WGRZ.com. We've got our Storm Team 2 Winter Outlook posted there, along with several different explainers on what El Nino could do and other factors that have played into this season. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Heather's Weather-Wise. As always, remember, if you have a weather question, either post them in the comments on this video or tweet them to me. I'm at WGRZ-Heather. I'll see you next week, but until then, remember, it's good to be a geek.